So let's take a look at the app. Now, I have made a couple of assumptions before you start here. For one, I assume you know Python 3. And I assume, that would be number 2, you have a basic knowledge of Flask. You don't have to be a Flask expert. We're not going to actually do very much Flask things here. But you're not going to be completely thrown when you see the Python source code with Flask. So I'm making those 2 assumptions. Now, our goals here for this lesson are pretty straightforward. One, we want to get familiar with the app. What does it do? How does it work? The different pieces. And 2, we also want to adapt the app for Dockerization. So we're going to make the app a little bit more flexible so that it can run on containers on any platform at all and connect to any database at all. So we're going to make it a little bit more flexible. So in doing this, we're going to basically do 3 steps. I'm going to look at the app, look at the different files, and then we're going to add a main.py file. And the main.py file is just going to be a starter place so that we don't have to type flask run to run it. So that we can use something like gunicorn to run this in our container. And lastly, we're going to set the app to use environmental variables, basically data from the operating system or the container, when it's connecting to the database. So there we are. So to get started, when we look at our app, it's got a requirements.txt file. It's got a virtual environment, and I've already started the virtual environment, and you can do that once you've made a virtual environment by source and so forth. It's got a migrations folder already made because I've connected to the database previously, but it's there, and it's got an app folder, and that's where the app starts. So in the app folder, there's a file called dunderinit.py. So this is where it all starts. It imports some Python libraries. It loads environmental variables from a .env file, which we will use for testing on our local machine before we move it into Docker. It creates an SQLAlchemy object, and SQLAlchemy is the library we're going to use to connect to the database. It's going to be our kind of middle person. So we give commands to SQLAlchemy models. The models will communicate to the database and get the information from that. So it's a library we use to talk to the database. And we made a migrate object for the database migrations. No big deal. And this file has one function, create app. And the key thing here for our purposes is that it's got this app.config SQLAlchemy database URI field. And we're doing that, we're setting it equal to this currently. So this is what's called a connection string. And it tells us a few things. It tells SQLAlchemy a couple of things. It says, okay, we're going to connect to Postgres, and we're going to use the PsychoPG2 library, or engine. And then there's a colon and 2 forward slashes, and we're going to log in with a username, which is going to be Postgres, the default username for Postgres. There's a colon and then the password. Currently my password is blank, so there's nothing after the colon. Don't do that for a production database, and when we do deploy to the web, we're going to use an actual password. and then the @ symbol and our database host, which is localhost 127.0.0.1, basically means the host machine. And the default port number for Postgres is 5432. And then the last thing on this thing is a slash and the name of the database we're trying to connect to. So there we are. And we can test it by doing like flask db init. There's already a migrations folder, so db migrate and db upgrade. So it's able to connect and run. No problem. First thing I'm going to do is set this up so that I'm going to do touch main.py, and we're going to create a file to start up the app just using the regular Python command. So to do that, go back to VS Code and main.py, currently it's empty. And from the app package, I'm going to import create app. And I'm going to import OS because later on we're going to use environment variables. And app is going to equal create app. I'm just going to call the function. So there we are. And if dunder name equals dunder main, so if this is the file, this file is being run by itself, the initial file being run, I'm going to print starting app just for debugging purposes, letting me know it's working. And I'll do app.run. And for now, I'm going to set debug equals true. For production, I probably wouldn't do that. But this will give us more logging and things, and more details about error messages. And host, I am going to just hard code this for now. This later on I can replace with an environment variable. And port equals 8080. So I'm going to start this thing off on port 8080. I can test and see if it's working by doing python 3 main.py. So it seems to be running. And if I bring my Flask over, seems to work. And if I go to the root route, I get a little JSON response. Seems okay. And I can see logs of the requests I made. So our API is working. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to try to make this more flexible and use environmental variables instead, oops, wrong dunder init, instead of hard coding it like this. So in my app folder, I make a new file, set up db.py, and in my setup db.py, I am going to first import OS for environment variables, and from app, actually I don't need to do that, I can import SQL Alchemy. So def, I'm going to make a function called get TCP connection string. And there are two ways to connect to a Postgres database. There is a Unix socket and over TCP. They both have their pluses and minuses. I think a Unix socket in a lot of ways is nicer, but this is more simple to understand and get working to start with. So we're going to do it this way. And now I'm going to make some environment variables. So db user equals os.getEnv. And getEnv takes two parameters. One is the name of the environment variable. So I'm going to say db user. And the default value, so I'll say Postgres for now. And db password is going to be os.getEnv. I'll just make that the empty string by default. And then there is db name for the name of the database and db host and I'll just start off on localhost and db underscore port. And environment variables are always strings, so you can't set them to a integer by default, or at least you shouldn't. So I'm getting this from an environment variable. If it doesn't exist, or if it's none, it'll use this value. So this way, if I'm missing the environment variables, it'll at least try something. And now I can just return sql-alchemy.engine.url.capital URL. So I'm going to return a new URL object. And the driver name is going to be PostgreSQL plus. And if you don't want to memorize that, you can always look here and just copy and paste for that. And the username is going to be the db user. And the password is going to be the db pass. I accidentally typed dp. Okay. And the host is going to be equal to db host. And the port is going to equal the db port. And the database is equal to db name. It's the name of the database. So there we are. So I've got a function that puts together a connection string for me from environment variables. I just need to, instead of using this hard-coded string, I need to first, from app.setupdb, import get TCP connection string. So I'll import that function I wrote, and then I'll call it, and that's going to set that up. And since I've already got default values that should work, if I run this, nope, I apparently misspelled something. It's always good to test stuff. So, host GRESQL plus PSY CO psycho PG2. So now let's try it. And I got the idea because it said can't load plugin, and then it gives us the plugin details. So let's run it again. Still have a problem. And that is because my default value is apparently not valid, because it was complaining about zeros. So I'll do 127.0.0.1. Oh, the data. My problem is actually the database port. The default value is 5432. So there we are. And now if I test it again on my browser, refresh, yep, it's still working. And if I do /tasks, it's still an empty list because I haven't done anything yet, but that's fine. I know it's connecting. And I can see the requests that got done. So, all right. So in summary, we looked at the dunder-init.py file in app and saw that, okay, it uses this to set up how it connects to the database. And we made a function here to put together a connection string from environment variables. And we're using the SQL Alchemy file. We could have just done string interpolation and basically used this as our template. But I kind of like relying on the library to put this together. And the last thing we did is we built a main.py file. So we can run this just with Python instead of doing Flask run. Okay, so in the next lesson, we're going to learn how we can Dockerize this and then get it to run the app in a Docker container, and how we can pass environment variables into the container.